What I'd like to do today is just to talk about some of my observations, and they're going to be of a very practical nature. I'm not going to talk about sort of general theories of public administration, but instead sort of give you an overview of our federal government and how it works and what it does, and then within that framework raise the question about performance management and how it occurs, or maybe in some cases doesn't occur as well as it should. As has been pointed out, I have been working in the Office of Management and Budget for 29 years. Before that, I was in the Department of Housing and Urban Development for 5 years. So I have a total of 34 years of federal experience. And when at OMB, I worked in a variety of departments and had oversight of a variety of departments and agencies on both the domestic side and on the national security side more recently. I'm here to talk about two broad issues that highlight the U.S. experience. First of all, I just want to lay out for you the answer to the basic question about what does the federal government spend taxpayer dollars on to achieve its goals. And then secondly, when you have a sense of how our budget is set up and what it's used for, I'll talk about some of the management tools that we in the federal government use to achieve or to link resources to results. First of all, let me just give a quick overview of the federal system in the United States. At the federal level, the key responsibilities are for a major amount of income transfer from the federal government to individuals. And that includes things like Social Security. These are pensions for those of us who are 65 and older. I never thought I'd get to that age, but here I am. And also pensions for all federal civil servants, pensions for the military, Medicare. Medicare is a program providing health insurance for those who are over 65. Food stamps, that is a program that provides low-income households vouchers to be used to subsidize their food. Defense, of course. Veterans Affairs, and I might add that the role, and you can imagine, given what's been going on in our country over the last 12 years, the emphasis on taking care of our veterans has really increased resource focus on that function. But all of that is done in the federal government, and 90% of that goes to medical care for veterans, but there's also other programs such as disability compensation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The federal highway system, that's another federal function that was established in 1958 by President Eisenhower. Of course, there are a lot of state and local roads that our state and local governments either build or maintain. Lastly, or not quite lastly, but Homeland Security. This is another function at the federal level. And the big change there, again, came after 9/11 when we decided that as a country we needed to consolidate a lot of our Homeland Security functions into one major new department, the Department of Homeland Security. That was a really difficult process, I can tell you, and I don't think it's a process that's still completed because there are a lot of very powerful institutions within that Homeland Security office that really don't like being part of the Homeland Department, but that's a work in progress. National parks, one of our, I think, greatest legacies. We run through our Department of Interior some of the really beautiful national parks, and I hope you can all come and visit someday. Hydropower, this is, I'm talking here about the really big dams that impact several states. And then lastly, research and development, which is funded through a variety of agencies at the federal level, and involves either funding going to laboratories, academicians, and a variety of other entities. So that's a quick encapsulation of what the federal government does. At the state level, you have really three, and again, I'm giving you a broad swath here. I'm not, you're gonna, those of you who are really smarter than me will probably say, oh, I know that the state government does this and this and this. I'm trying to give you an emphasis of where the key responsibilities lie. So for the states, the big program is medical care for the poor, or it's called Medicaid. Secondly, the state universities. We have a really good state university system, and that is provided through the states. Again, richer states tend to have better universities. Poorer states have poor state universities. And then state roads. And finally, at the local level, we're talking about public schools, waste pickup, water, clean water, street, road maintenance, police, fire services. So that's just a quick overview of the various key responsibilities of the three levels of government. And I don't want to, again, pretend that this is as clear-cut as this suggests. It's more of a marble effect. And my note at the bottom of this points to a particular tension in our system. And that is when the federal government provides new mandates to the states without a corresponding increase in revenues. It's always an issue, and I don't know if you have the same issue in India. I think I did read that you might have that same issue, but this is a very sensitive thing on the part of the states. So whenever a new piece of legislation is under consideration, we at OMB will always be looking at, well, what does this mean in terms of its impact on the states? Because the states don't have the same flexibility that the federal government has in borrowing money. Many of them, not many, some of them can borrow money, but many of them cannot, and most of them have to balance their budget. Really important point, they have to balance their budget. So if the revenues are down, they have to figure out how to cut programs. We at the federal level have never had that discipline. So that's an important point. The first question that I talked about was how the federal government spends taxpayer dollars to achieve its goals. And in line with those responsibilities that I laid out for you, there's a very important key point, and that is that 2/3 of all federal spending goes to income transfers. And I want to make that point very slowly because it frames the kinds of questions that come up with respect to performance management. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it means that you're going to focus on improper payments. Either they're too high or too low. Are we getting the right amount of money to an individual who is eligible? So when I talk about income transfers, I said there were really two performance issues that seem to come up over and over again. Are we paying people the right amount? And two, are we giving them their payments in a timely manner? The reason that those are really the two performance questions is because the eligibility criteria that define what people receive is in law. We can't change it. The food stamp program has a very specific piece of legislation that lays out who gets food stamps. The same for Social Security, the same for Medicare. So for those of us in the executive branch, we're looking at performance management, when we're focusing on this 2/3 of the total funding that's going out, we are focusing on those two questions. Now, having said that, many of us believe that we need to examine in much more detail the combined effect of all of these income transfers and look at some of those criteria for eligibility, because so much of our growth in our deficit is caused by this spending. and it's, in some people's view, out of control. Why is it somewhat out of control? It is because it is referred to as a mandatory program. We have two kinds of spending in our budget: discretionary, mandatory. If a program is called mandatory, it means it's really not subject to an annual budget. We spend on that program whatever is needed to spend on that program because of the demands from our population, assuming they are eligible and we are giving them the right payment. So that body, or that 2/3 of our spending, has been growing and growing at a very high rate. And that is why, if you look at some of the deficit spending literature, they always focus on this program, or this set of programs. The second category of federal funds goes through, and I don't have the exact number, and the reason I don't have the exact number is I kept finding different numbers, believe it or not. Having worked for the budget this many years, I found that somebody has said there's 1,200 programs that the federal government has for state and local spending. Another one said 200, so I'm going to say hundreds. We have hundreds of programs, and I know you have a fair number as well, that funnel money from the federal government to states and localities. But if you look at the total amount of spending that is going through all of those hundreds of federal programs, it's only 20% of the federal budget. So that, is just a factoid that I give you to underscore the size of this sector versus the income transfers. And we spend that money through a variety of ways. In particular, we have a small number of block grants. What does a block grant mean? It's a very general, flexible grant that gives the state and/or locality a great deal of flexibility in how they spend their money. And many of these block grants were established during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. If you recall, Ronald Reagan was a very conservative Republican president who believed, and a lot of people believed, that many of these grants were too prescribed. So aside from the block grants, we have the categorical formula grants, and just to give you an example there, we would include in there the federal highway grant system that we have. So in sum, we have 3 different kinds of grants that compose the funding that goes from the federal government to the state and local government. This chart right here simply shows what I've told you already, that federal grants to state and local governments is trending up a little bit recently, but roughly at about 20%. The next chart shows you where that money is going to the state and local governments. As I said before, most of this is for medical assistance for lower income families, which has been the fastest growing area over time. Again, why is this? Other than, of course, there's a demand for this. The second reason is that this is a mandatory program. It is not subject to an annual budget process, whereas these other categories of federal aid to state and local governments are subject to an annual budget review. And the reason that is important is because in the last, I would say, 15, 20 years, we have been, as a country, focused very much on constraining our discretionary spending. And you would say, well, why is this discretionary and why is the other mandatory? And I probably say that's a book that's probably 1,200 pages to answer it. There's a lot of history there. But if the kind of spending happens to be classified as discretionary, it means that the annual budget process that OMB, my agency, puts together and sends to Congress has to review it. If it's in the mandatory side, it doesn't get really seriously reviewed until there is a policy decision at the highest levels that we are going to do something about quote-unquote entitlement reform. And I think if we ever achieve the kind of consensus we don't currently have as a country, and as you all know probably, right now my government is in a shutdown mode. Why did that happen? That happened, and it's hard to explain, I think, to a lot of people around the world. It happened because we have a party in the House, we have a House and a Senate, and the party that controls the House has a very, very different view of, or different priorities than the President or even the Senate. But because of that, the Senate and the House cannot achieve even yet a compromise on how to keep the government running, simply running, because the House believes that this is a moment of leverage for them. And they are going to use this moment to see if they can get some political policy changes that they want in the health bill that just passed a few years ago, Obamacare, as we call it. They believe that that bill is too expensive. They don't like certain parts of the bill. Ultimately, I think that they're not going to prevail, and we will get some sort of compromise in terms of a budget resolution, which means allowing our government to sort of hobble along. But it's having been in the federal government a long time and working in this environment recently, I can tell you it's a very difficult time to be working in the Office of Management and Budget when you have such a lack of consensus. And this is, again, to also underscore a key difference between India and the United States. We do not have a parliamentary system. We have a separation of powers. And what that means is the government, the executive branch, of which I was a member, would propose a budget, would propose legislation, but that doesn't mean it will pass. And some of my examples later will show how that's how that has happened. So let me talk then about the third category of spending by the federal government, which is money that goes to either for-profit or not-for-profit contractors through some sort of competitive process. This represents, again, about 20% of the total federal budget. And the money here is going out through, so the third category of spending is the area where most of our performance management has focused, because this is the money that is going out through a merit-based system, a competition in most cases, either to contractors in the private sector or to state and local governments. And it's usually a very transparent process. We put something in a notice in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is a public document that anyone who's in the business of contracting for the government reads on a weekly or daily basis to know what is coming out from the federal government in terms of contracts. So my key points here are, one, that over time, income transfers to individuals have grown at a much faster rate than the other two categories, particularly in the area of health subsidies for the elderly. And secondly, one of the reasons I would say this is because it's This is money that just goes out and does not get subject to an annual budget review. And then thirdly, I would say that when we are talking about federal performance management efforts that we have had a lot of involvement in, it's been much more in this third category of spending. Let me just talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of these three different groups of spending. Direct income transfers. From my perspective, it's money that goes out directly to recipients, and it's based on legal criteria. Once instituted, though, it is very hard ever to change the criteria because they're set in law. And once that's done, it's that you have to have a major political push to change it, and it's extremely difficult in our system. It will require congressional legislation. And again, I think I talked about what the key performance issues are there. State and local grants. What are some of the pros and cons of that type of transfer? Well, states in our system love block grants. We have a community development block grant that is used to support development in poor areas. We have a social services block grant, and the states and locals love that because they get a lot of flexibility. Conversely, there is less federal oversight by design. By design. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute because it doesn't mean that there's no oversight, but it's not the kind of oversight I think that you are often thinking of. We don't have IAS officers in our state governments. There's no one like me at the federal level who works in the states watching how things happen. There is, I think, a strong tradition in our country of states' rights. And so states have a very sort of proprietary interest in making sure that they do, what is legal, but they don't want the federal government too much in their backyard when it comes to looking at how they're spending their block grant money, because they see that as their money within certain parameters. And so I think I was asked the question, if you're designing a new state and local program, what would you do? Would you create more flexibility or less flexibility? And in my view, I think it really depends on what your policy desire is. If it is a policy area where you want lots of consistency across all of your states, a block grant is probably not the right way to go. And I think if you're talking, that might be for such things as transportation or health care. You would probably not do that because your overriding federal goal here is to create some sort of coordination and rationalization and egalitarian approaches to health care. And you would want to achieve that through a federal grant that has very specific kinds of criteria and oversight that you will not get in a block grant. And thirdly, for federal competitive allocation, that allows for the greatest federal oversight and control of performance of recipients, whether they're private or not-for-profit contractors. Let me give an example. If it's a construction project or a major acquisition project, the federal government has a lot of oversight and rules, legislation that involves making sure we establish, for example, a cost baseline for a major project and a time baseline. And then we have reviews to see if that baseline, if the reality is deviating from that baseline. And if it is, we even have legislation in certain areas which requires us to notify Congress that we are deviating from the cost and the time frame, where it's going to cost more, it's going to take longer, and we have to lay out all the reasons why. And it is also, and sometimes when that happens, we will reconsider a program. We may de-scope it, meaning we will reduce the size of it, or sometimes we simply stop the program. A few years ago, we were in the process of building a linear collider, and the total cost was started out at like 8 to 10 billion, and we were about halfway through that project when we had already spent 8 to 10 billion. And there was a decision made to stop the project, which was a huge decision to make. But those things do happen. And lastly, one of the points I added here is that at OMB now, we try to insert into any new legislation that's going to authorize a program, I think you call it a scheme, a requirement that there be an evaluation done by an outsider. And I'm going to make a guess, probably 50% of the time, Congress goes along with that. Not always. My experience is that Congress is not always as enamored of some of these performance management requirements. And I can go into that a little bit more later. So we may propose these things, but we don't always get them. My next chart talks about how do we do oversight? What kinds of entities in the federal government of the United States exist to oversee government and its performance? As with, I think, many things in the United States, it's a pluralist society, and we have a lot of different such entities. In Congress, we have a variety of committees with very protected jurisdictions over either the appropriations process or the authorization process, as we call it, and they will hold hearings, and they will call agencies up to task. And some of those hearings are very intense. Many times they're publicized, or at a minimum, if they're not publicized on TV, there will be a lot of trade press, as we call them, there at those hearings reporting out what is going on in the hearings. We also have something called agency inspector generals. These are independent entities within each federal department. They do not report to the department, although they are part of it, and they get their budget separately from the department. But they oversee the department in the following ways. They will receive requests from people to do investigations on fraud and abuse, and I'd say that's mostly what they do. But they will also occasionally do evaluations. Those reports also go to OMB, they go to the Congress, they're posted publicly. In addition, there is the General Accountability Office. This is an entity of, or related entity of the legislative branch that does major program evaluations. Congressional Budget Office, this is also an office that does more budget-focused work. Congressional Research Office, among many others, private foundations. And I guess I also wouldn't want to miss the point about our media. Having worked in the Executive Office of the President for a long time, one of the things that I've noticed, or I noticed over the years, is the increasing amount of my time that had to be focused on responding to inquiries from the media. The presidency is a place that's just constantly being barraged with questions about why this is happening or that's happening in a particular program, why some, you know, it doesn't matter what it is, just all over the place. And the president, no matter who the president is, he wants us to give an answer fast, because he doesn't want a story out there that says, well, the president, we called the White House about this problem and we couldn't get an answer. So I would say that on a given day, about 25% of my time went to responding to those questions. And what's interesting is that the reporters want the answers to come out of the White House. They don't want the answers to come out of the departments. So that, you know, just because if it comes out of the White House, that has more of a, you know, it has more clout. And so this meant that we were always checking in with the departments, checking in with other sources to try and figure out how to respond. I don't know if you have the same phenomenon in India, but this is clearly a major, I don't want to say major, but it's a change over time in my perspective in terms of how much of a role they play. And lastly, I just want to make the point that among all of these oversight entities that we have, there is a lot of sharing of information. We have conferences like the one you have here, which I applaud. I think this is a great venue for sharing of information on an international basis. We need to do more of that. But we do it internally. We find out, we talk to each other about what the latest studies are, what programs are being evaluated, so we can, at OMB, feed that into our budget review. Now let me talk just a little bit, and I'm going to do this in I think a broad overview, because I understand that you've had some exposure to the performance management system in the United States. I would just say that in the 1960s, the field of program evaluation emerged in our country, and it really took root in some of the graduate schools of public policy, where those in the economics field and those in the political field of political science came together and decided then hopefully that the tools of economics and statistics could be used to analyze public policy programs and understand what was really going on. And about that time, many departments, not all, set up offices within the agencies to do evaluations of programs in those departments. And I think the goal was to focus, as I said, on evaluating the program performance using empirical data. I think it would be fair to say that that movement lost some oomph. It lost some enthusiasm in the 80s and 90s. And in part, I think it was because it was found that, first of all, I think our budget was growing quite a bit then, and there wasn't as much interest in looking at cost-benefit kinds of questions. But I also think that some of the challenges in working with, you know, statistical programs like multiple regression analysis overwhelmed many of the researchers, and they weren't sure that some of the key policy questions were really being answered by some of the economic tools. During the Bush administration, there was a very comprehensive approach that was taken to evaluate every single federal program. And there are, I don't know, probably 8,000 of them, a lot of them. And I would say that approach relied on a rather cursory evaluation of each program, but it was then published and made very public so that anybody could go on the web and understand how programs were working. And then in 1993, legislation was passed which said, let's refocus and look at our overall, we all had, strategies or strategic documents for each of our departments. This legislation said, let's take those strategies and decide what are the few critical or priority goals that relate to those strategies. And each agency then, having identified that goal, would set up a process that I show in this next chart to have an overview process that started with OMB engaging with agency heads, identifying goal leaders, developing action plans, quarterly updates, doing performance reviews with data, and then putting all of that information on websites. That process is ongoing now. It's a work in process, but I think it is going fairly well. I give you some examples in this next chart about how we are tracking specific goals in the Department of Social Security Administration. They set up a goal that said by the end of 2013, they would have 48%, excuse me, that wasn't their goal, that's what they actually had achieved. They were achieving 36% in 2011. They are now achieving 48% of their filings for benefits online. The Department of Veterans Affairs is another example where they set a priority goal to reduce the backlog of claims for veterans' disability compensation. This backlog issue had become a major problem politically for the White House, and as a result, there was a tremendous amount of focus from the highest levels in the White House, National Security Council, the Domestic Policy Council, OMB, as well as senior members of the agency to bring the backlog down. How was backlog defined? That meant that you were waiting more than 125 days for your disability compensation. You might think that that's even too long. Probably a lot of veterans will agree with you. But we have made quite a bit of success, and I think we're now going to achieve a complete elimination of that backlog in 2015. Again, just to give you other examples, as I said, this talk is about my experience and giving examples rather than talking about so much the theory of public management, but to show you how we're working it, and in some cases successfully, in some cases it's not so successful. Cross-cutting policy goals are very, very difficult to achieve in any federal government. And those have been our biggest challenge in Washington. One of them is to end homelessness of all veterans. And that requires work between the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as local service providers. And so far, we are making, and also I should say, an integration with our budget. We've had to make sure that in our budget process we've had enough funds put into this particular initiative. And as I note here, in 2012, the annual homeless count came down from to 62,619 homeless, which is about a 7.2% decline in 2011. I don't give all these details, but it is coming down. An example of something that was not successful, we have a lot of science and technology training programs that the federal government runs across many federal agencies to improve the science and math education of our students in the United States. You know, the joke is, it's, you know, that you need to, the Indian students are always the best in science and technology. They don't need these programs, but the American students do need special tutoring to do well in science and technology. So we have a lot of programs to do that. And they're uncoordinated. They focus on different groups of people. They haven't been evaluated. Anyway, it was something that the president said he really wanted to focus on. So OMB, the Domestic Policy Council, which is an office within the White House complex, and several departmental officials, and it took all of those people coming together, came up with a proposal to consolidate and integrate and come up with a proposal for a limited number of programs that focused on those where there was evidence that they were more successful. And we included that in our budget. We sent it up to Congress. Congress did not accept it. And you would probably ask, well, why? Why did they not accept it? It makes sense. And I guess the question I would answer this way, and that is, in our system of government, again, it's a very decentralized approach to power. I think our forefathers believed that too much power in one place corrupted. So we have not only a separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branch, we have within the legislative branch a lot of different committees. And those are powerful committee heads. And when they saw a proposal coming up that took a program out of their jurisdiction and put it into another jurisdiction because it wasn't effective, they didn't like that. So I think next time our government, our executive branch has to go back to the drawing board and do a lot more reaching out to the Congress in advance and see if we can convince them to go along with this. I've talked a little bit, or more than a little bit, about the federal government. Let me just highlight some of the things that are going on at the state and local level. First of all, local governments. A lot is going on, and I would say it's a very diverse approach, most of it really without involvement of the federal government. Example here is New York City Police Commissioner in the 1990s was really focused on reducing crime in New York City. The mayor was pressing him hard because people didn't want to come into the city. It was too dangerous to walk around. So he set up these very data-driven reviews on crime by district and drove his decision making about where to focus police presence. And that had an impact. More broadly, New York City has a website that contains all sorts of performance measures, including monthly scorecards on the percent of acceptably clean streets and sidewalks by section of New York City. So every month that comes out on a website and people in the city can see how their bureau is doing. Similarly, the city of Chicago has a website, and I've given them here to you if you want to go look at them. Tracks a variety of performance measures, in particular with respect to how long it takes to get various permits and certificates, which has been a focus here in this country. You know, a building permit, a license to run a restaurant. They have targets, and they show how many in each area, whether they're being successful in meeting them or not. States, the same thing. There's a lot of creativity that's going on, and I've given you here several websites for Washington, Maryland, California, and Utah. And they do it differently, but they're all sort of doing, taking the same approach, something that you really wouldn't have seen 10 years ago. This is all new, and I'm hoping that it spreads to more states. Then the last thing I'd like to talk about is collaborative efforts that are a new thing, I think, that has happened in the last few years. These are collaborative efforts between different levels of our government, be it federal, state, local, and the private sector, to improve how government works. Some of these initiatives involve the federal government, others are between, say, the state and local entities and the private sector. One of these efforts is called Results First Initiative, and this doesn't even involve the federal government at all. It's two national organizations called Pew and I can't remember the other, the MacArthur Foundation. They provided a lot of money and technical assistance to selected states, such as New Mexico, which is a very, very poor state, to do the kind of analysis that they weren't able to do, or New Mexico wasn't able to do on its own. And as a result, now New Mexico can now estimate the costs of a number of social problems in the state: adult and juvenile crime, child abuse, substance abuse, and low education attainment. This next chart shows you the cost estimates to society in New Mexico that they have come up with. The lifetime total benefits of selected outcomes in New Mexico. If we can avoid a reconviction of someone who's in prison, that's $121,000. Avoiding one case of child abuse neglect, that's worth $99,000, and so on. They've done this in a collaborative way with these foundations and using data that they had, and now the next step will be to look at their programs that they operate, see which ones are more successful, and thirdly, hopefully, allocate resources accordingly. Another collaborative effort involves the federal government and state government, looking at justice spending, and I would say the key thing there is that the federal government has told the states, we will give you lots more flexibility if you prove to us that using the money we give you in a flexible way has results. And you can then take your savings and put that into other kinds of programs. And that is just underway, but provides a lot of promise in the future. Another collaboration involves federal, state, local, and tribal, our Native American reservations, where we're providing money to the state and local governments for pilots, where they are trying to reduce the amount of improper payments, and hopefully then we'll do evaluations of those pilots and use them to expand to a broader usage, or broader authorization, if in fact they work. I won't go into a lot of detail on some of the other ones here. The federal, state, local performance partnership pilots for disconnected youth. And again, the key point here is that the federal government is again allowing more flexibility to state and local governments if they can show that by having that flexibility, they're having a greater impact. To do all of that, it involves senior level coordination among departments, seeking input from foundations, businesses, the academic world, local governments, and various nonprofit organizations. And lastly, with respect to our block grants, we are as I think I told you, this is the most flexible form of spending, and states love it. To give you an example, the Community Development Block Grant is allocated to more than 1,100 local and state governments on a formula basis. The funding has to be consistent with broad national priorities, but beyond that, the states have a lot of flexibility. One of the things that we're doing is proposing that they set aside at least 5% of that money to be used for what we call evidence-based initiatives. We're not trying to take away all of their flexibility, but we're saying, in the future, we'd like you to focus on what really works, and so we are putting into law that requirement. So in summary, I would say that with respect to federal aid to state and local governments, the numbers of grant programs have expanded considerably with much diversity and complexity. And that, in the view of many, has led to a lot of burden on state and local governments. So at a minimum, one of the things we're trying to do is streamline the grants management processes to reduce the burden on the grantees. We've set up something called grants.gov, which is a single portal for finding and applying for grants. But the key goal is how to allow, and this is the goal I think that you are facing, how to allow for accountability and yet some flexibility simultaneously. In the United States, as I said before, we do not have senior civil servants in the federal government, referred to as SES, in the states. The states probably would have a revolution if we tried to do that. So we have to work on achieving that accountability in, I guess I would say, more creative ways. As I said, we have a multiplicity of oversight agencies. There's also the media, and more recently, and what we call our evidence-based focus in the future, and trying to encourage state and local governments to fund those efforts that have evidence behind them. It may well be that we don't have the kind of day-to-day accountability that there should be, but within our system, I would say there's probably a little more comfort with the notion of states' rights. That doesn't mean, you know, if it comes to fraud and abuse, that's a very different matter. We care a lot about that, and that's why we have our inspectors generals. But I think in terms of allowing states to experiment and focus on those kinds of programs that work, we're willing to give them more leeway. And lastly, I would say that you know, this dovetails, I think, some of the comments made earlier by Professor Kundwala. It's clearly a work in progress in the United States. There are different views about the importance of performance management, even within our executive branch and within our Congress. And so I think the most important thing is our leadership and bringing in people at the top who really care about this. And as I was noting earlier, at the very top of our system are political appointees, not our senior civil servants. And some of them really care about it, and some of them may not care as much. So if you're in a position like I am, you have to learn to be agile and respond to the political preferences of those who come in. But I think, having said that, everybody supports evidence-based type of budgeting, and that is the direction that OMB has been moving in. It doesn't mean that budget decisions are exclusively tied to evidence just because of the nature of the budget process. It's an inherently political process, but it's hard for people to ignore evidence and results when that information is provided to them. So thank you very much.
In addition to the question, you mentioned about you don't have the IAS officers working in the states. But I would like to correct the impression in our country also, the federal service people, when they work in the state, they work under the state. When they work in the state, they work under the control of the state government. They are not the representatives of the. That's one correction that I wanted to make. But the question that I want to ask is about the block grants. You said that you do keeping in view the priorities of the federal government. But I just want to know whether the preferences or prejudices, whether to allocate to different states controlled by different governments, see where the governor may be Democrat and the federal government may be Republican. Those factors.
So Kumar, if I could just summarize two. One is comment and the other is a question. One is simply the observation that the IAS officers working in the state are under the control of the state. So they may be recruited centrally when they are working. So that's just an observation on who controls them. The question was that how do you prevent, I suppose, discrimination, political discrimination when you're giving block grants between Democratic and Republican states? So how do you, what is the system to ensure that no one blames you for discrimination, political discrimination?
With respect to block grants, there is a formula that is proscribed or prescribed in legislation. So that money goes out according to that formula, that the amounts of money that go to each state are public immediately. Everybody can see what everybody else got, and they can do a check to make sure it's consistent with the formula, which I think is essentially based on population and maybe one or two other factors.
All right. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. I have two questions. The first, you said the OMB and Congress, before a program is accepted, you rely upon the reports of multiple entities, and you just made some description on that. But if I understood correctly, some of these entities have also been receiving funds from the local government or state government. Now, I would like to know what are these entities and who forms? Are they NGOs or supported by state or central government, or these are independent bodies? Are there also individuals, or are they opinion makers? So some elaboration on the type of entities who help you in the decision making process. And the second is, ma'am, I think shale gas development in US has been a tremendous success. And you in the first slide mentioned about mandatory spending, and the last point was pertaining to R&D. So I'm 100% sure that some amount of resources must have been put by the center, I don't know, connected with shale gas or not. Or was it entirely a private initiative? Or was it a public-private initiative? Or was it at the state level? I would like to know, because it's been a tremendous amount of development in the last 1 decade, which has changed the entire chemistry or history and the future of the US as far as energy is concerned. Thank you.
So,
connected question.
Yeah.
That same, that's what I thought I'll ask you for a little elaboration. In your federal spending, ma'am, I do not think there was any mention of the State Department, which would be, I think, encompassing various kinds of activities globally also, which you have not mentioned, as what percentage of the US budget, and whether it is mandated or it is voted and how it is supervised. Secondly, about the Department of Energy, I think, which my colleague just mentioned, which again is a hugely federally controlled department ranging across all sectors of energy. That also, I think, is a totally federally controlled department, which we did not find mentioned.
All right, you can start.
I'll answer this one. The State Department is indeed a federal responsibility, and it is funded within the discretionary part of the budget. So each year, it must prepare a budget and have it reviewed. The State Department has more difficulty getting resources from the U.S. Congress than, say, the Department of Defense. And one of the struggles of that department is to get the funding that it wants. But yes, every year it goes through, it is a major federal responsibility. The Department of Energy is also clearly a major part of the federal responsibility. As you may or may not know, about 1/3 of the Department of Energy actually is responsible for a defense function. It maintains our nuclear stockpile, and of course that is because it is a national security function. I sort of put that in under the defense, and then most of the rest of the department, the energy side of it, is R&D, research and development of alternative forms of energy, basic science, either at the labs, or mostly at the labs, or at universities. So points well taken.
So I think that probably touches one part of the question that Dr. Ramachandran had was, she was impressed with your achievements in the shale gas or the shale achievements, and she wanted to know that how did they come about? I mean, what was the reason? Is it the Department of Energy's research R&D initiatives, or was it private sector driven? How did you, because it has given a lot of energy independence in the last 10 years, and she's just curious about that.
I'll just supplement this a little bit.
All right.
One got the impression from your presentation that all the R&D spending is from federal funds, but from state funds also, there would be R&D spending. Each state has its own environmental goal. So that is also addressed. And as a corollary to that, there was no mention about the state resources being utilized, how that is overseen by the states. You have talked about the entire federal funding system, but what about the state programs and projects?
So let me just, to simplify, first is the shale R&D. How did it come about, your revolution in shale? Who really did it, public, private, or was it combination? That's one question Dr. Ramachandran has. Mr. Ghosh has supplemented. He's saying that's fine, but what about R&D at the state level, and how do you hold this? How do states hold themselves accountable for their own funds? He's saying their own activities. We have not focused on that. You just focus on the federal perspective on the state. So there are two questions.
I think that the growth in collaborative efforts with the foundations, with academics, with other kinds of nonprofit organizations has occurred primarily because of an increasing sense that federal dollars are very constrained. And because of that, I think everybody has come to the sort of notion that we have to start focusing on what works. And we have to focus on greater flexibility if the evidence supports that that makes sense. And I think some of the leaders in this kind of thinking have come from outside the government. Some of the national organizations, like MacArthur Foundation, like the Pew Trust, these are very heavily, I will say, they're well-endowed institutions that have started raising the question of to the federal government and some of our White House leaders that they would like to be partners in doing work with either the federal government or with state and local governments to, one, improve their technical capacity to do evaluations, to look at evidence, to bring together experts along with our typical bureaucrats and to come up with new ways of working together. I don't want to pretend that this is happening across the board, but it's happening much more frequently than in the past. And I think the evidence to date is that when you work collaboratively with both the private sector, some of these nonprofit organizations, think tanks, as we call them, universities, the results improve. And we're sort of in the early stages of looking at what the evidence shows there. But I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but in the energy world, that's a major effort.
The question is, do you bring these together or they come on their own?
Yes, we, when the federal government is involved, we facilitate the bringing together of these people. And it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time because we have to coordinate not only within the White House complex, as we call it, Executive Office of the President, to make sure that everybody's on board with doing this. We then have to reach out to the department heads that have specific line responsibility for that policy area. And then we reach out to whoever it is that we're going to be collaborating with, whether it's a state government or maybe just the private sector. And I think the proof is so far that it works, that we get a lot more creativity from that kind of collaboration. People like working that way. And so, I think it's sort of an optimistic trend. But yes, it's usually the federal government that has to do the sort of pulling together. On the other hand, at the state, and one of my examples show that at the state level, some of these big private organizations, such as the MacArthur Foundation, have worked with the states without the federal involvement. They came and briefed some of their work to the federal government, to my office, and we encouraged them. We said, this is wonderful, do it. And in some cases we encourage them by giving some, additional funds, either in the budget or in other ways. So it's both.
The first question was on the acceptability of a program by OMB and the Congress, and then you go through the reports of multiple entities. I want to hear, what are these entities and how do you make choices and whose reports you rely upon? How do you make decisions on that?
If I understand your question correctly, I think you're asking about what do you do when Congress doesn't go along with what you want?
No, she's asking when you accept a program and you say you accept it based on the feedback from multiple entities.
Yeah.
She's asking who are these entities? That's what she's asking. Who's giving you the feedback? NGOs or universities?
Oh, you mean we and the federal government?
OMB.
How are we getting feedback?
Feedback on your when you decide a program whether this is worthwhile or not worthwhile, whether you'll fund it or not fund it, and you said
I got it.
She's just taking that
We will get feedback from all of the players. I mean, we will have the foundation there, we will have the state there. It tends to be a rather broad and representative group.
So all stakeholders, I mean,
all
whoever,
of the stakeholders.
all kinds
yes,
of.
there's a.
So it could be NGOs as well as states and state level. But
I guess I would just say, in our country, there's a lot of different stakeholders, and they're very organized. Depending on the issue. But in our society, there's just many, many, many organizations representing particular stakeholders. And I think that President Obama in particular is a very inclusive president. So they get access a lot. They get access to the White House, they get access to OMB. Sometimes those of us in the SES feel that the burden is excessive, right, because we have to be at a lot of meetings, but ultimately I think that that kind of interaction is very helpful, because we value that information very much, whether it's from a small little stakeholder or a big one. So there is a very high premium put on getting that kind of information.
I'll just come to you in a minute, but Mr. Shyamal Ghosh's question was that how do states hold themselves accountable for the funds that they control, whether from you or their own funds? What is the...
Well, if it's from our funds, the question will depend on whether it's a block grant where they have a tremendous amount of flexibility, or it is not a block grant where they have much less flexibility. If it is the latter, then the law that authorizes that program lays out rather specifically what they can do. And if they're not doing that, there are various ways that we will find out about it, either from the Inspector General, we have program evaluation offices in the agencies that will get information. You know, they get people calling them and saying, you know, you better check this out, there's something going on here. They will go check it out. We have also, you know, in some agencies we have a fairly significant program evaluation budget that lets contracts out to private foundations and academics to review these programs, so we get an outside evaluation. That's another way. So it's a variety of ways that we watch what they're doing on our money, programs financed with our funds. If it is their own money, we don't really pay a lot of attention to that, to be honest, because in our country we believe if it's their source of revenue, then that...
I think the question was, what do they do about their own money?
What do they do? Well, I think, as I noted, some of them, in some states are more aggressive than others in holding performance reviews and making all of that information public on websites. California, Maryland, Washington, Utah are examples of states that are really way out there with very public and specific information. I think it usually requires a governor or a mayor who is a strong leader who cares about this. If you don't have that, then you may not have quite as much oversight.
Ms. Morgan.
I just wanted to make a brief comment, if I could, about the stakeholders. Because I don't know how to compare this to the India system, but I think it's a very critical part of the U.S. system in terms of providing feedback to policymakers. And when I say policymakers, I'm including people in the executive branch of government, and I am including people in the legislative branch of government. The U.S., for better or worse, has a system, a body of organizations that are generally referred to as lobbyists. And many people have a negative association with the word lobbyist, but I think the picture I'm going to paint is I don't know, more balanced. I don't know what the right word is. Lobbyists are organizations that represent any individual or group of organizations that want to influence or have a voice in the policy process. Most often, they are organizations that somehow receive a benefit from the federal government. That benefit could be through the tax code. That benefit could be through a direct subsidy, as we've been talking about today. The organizations could be a large group of, say, private petroleum companies. They could be a group of doctors. And when I say a group, I mean anyone who is a doctor can be a member of, for example, the American Medical Association. Could be a group of nurses. It could be a group of state institutions. It could be a group of local institutions. So it's private, it's public, it's nonprofit. Generally, these associations, membership associations, are formed by paying annual dues, and they provide an opportunity for people from the same profession and same line of work to come together, network, talk about the policy issues in their profession, and come together and create a consensus around how they, as a group of professionals, either public or private, want to influence the federal policy dialogue. So what does that mean? Every single year, when the president comes out with a budget, thousands, I don't know if it's maybe hundreds, thousands, I'm not sure what the right number is, of trade associations come out with a formal position on the president's budget. When Congress receives the president's budget and starts to review how they want to respond, hundreds or more of these trade associations comment on the congressional budget. They all have staff in Washington. They go and approach all the legislatures, all of the policymakers and Congress people to influence them, to let them know what their position is, and they do the same if they can in the executive branch of government. On one hand, these various lobbying groups clearly have an agenda, clearly want to put forth their agenda, and one could argue at times they are influencing public policy decisions in a way that is not positive, in a way that's not balanced and fair. On the other hand, they provide a critical source of information from industries and from professionals in each segment, a source of information, frankly, outside of government. And so, on one hand, while one could argue about the positive or negative effect of this influence, on the other hand, you could say many lobbying organizations provide a source of education and information into the public policy making process that is critical for decision making. And I'm sure you all know all the different controversies around this, but I thought it's very important for this to get into this discussion.
Okay, thank you. That was Ms. Grace Morgan. She is with the World Bank office in New Delhi. Mr. Razdan, you wanted to say something?
I'm glad that she clarified, because I think precisely on the shale gas question, it is the Halliburtons and the Schlumbergers who may have contributed to the presidential campaign. At the same time, they brought some new direction to the US economy. And of course, the federal government by itself can provide some relief by not insisting very strongly on environmental laws, on what chemicals we use in fracking, etc. The result is technology of fracking itself takes precisely. It is now precise. What is vertical drilling, but yes, horizontal, like three. But the point is that they managed to bring the cost of gas to a fraction of what it was.
Right. Thank you very much. These are all energy experts here. So, I mean, Dr. Ramachandran is from former ONGC and Mr. Razdan, Secretary Energy in our case, or electricity. Thank you very much. We will move on, but the question that Mr. Shamal Ghosh had asked about how states hold themselves accountable, the book that we will be sharing with you, it's called Extreme Makeover by one Mr. Ken Miller, worked in the governor of Minnesota's office, I believe, and this is the experience of how they hold themselves accountable. In fact, he is really how he did, and from that experience now he is trying to do it in other states. It's a fascinating book, and the reason we are sharing because it's a great piece of work on extreme government makeover, and written simply, but also it reflects the new public management, whatever that is. The last few questions, if there are any, otherwise the conversation can continue during lunchtime and, okay, yes, can't see.
Yeah, just wanted to know, I think you mentioned that the federal government spends something like about 12% on education. Would you disaggregate that? I mean, what is it at the elementary and what is it at the tertiary level? Would you be able to just throw some light on that?
The breakup of the 12%, how much of that education funding is for higher education and for tertiary, middle and lower education? Somewhere you had said 12% of your funding is for education. Okay, I see no hands. There are lots of questions. I mean, one question, since there are none, the last question. You said you have cross-agency targets and you're doing something about it. It wasn't clear precisely how the cross-agency efforts, because we are doing something also. We have same issue. I mean, all governments have the same issue. Departments can't do things alone. They have to work in collaboration, and we are famous for working in silos. And your challenge you mentioned was this cross-agency targets. But wasn't clear what precisely did you do to overcome that?
The question is, what has OMB or the federal government done to foster the necessary efforts needed for achieving cross-cutting policy goals? And that's a very good question, and it's also very, it's because it's so hard to make happen. I will give you, I think the first answer is that we have become, we're very appreciative of how hard that is, and the fact that it is almost always going to require involvement on the part of our White House, whether that is the Office of Management and Budget. Most often it's with the Office of Management and Budget and a particular policy council that is part of the Executive Office of the President. We're providing the sort of budget management voice. The policy council is providing the policy voice. We then call the meetings, and that means interagency meetings where we have to make absolutely certain we get the right representation at that meeting from the departments. Because if you don't have that representation at the right level, you're not going to make success. So we're extraordinarily aware of who it is that has to be at the meeting and the need for frequent meetings so that things don't get off track. And even when you do that, things can fall through the cracks. For example, as I gave an example, I think I talked about reducing the number of veterans who are homeless. That has been a success. The two departments really wanted to do that. They brought different things to that goal, and they provided them. OMB provided the money. It worked out. But it still was a lot of collaborative effort, leadership on the part of the agencies, and most importantly, leadership on the part of OMB and the policy councils. But there have been other efforts where it has not been so successful. For example, if you're a military member who has been in service for several years, you have an electronic health record, which has all of the information about you and your health. If you become a veteran by the fact that you retire from the military, the Veterans Department has a completely different electronic health record. And the records are, they're very different, they don't speak to each other, and because of that, you know, the average individual has all sorts of headache dealing with the two systems. We set up a high-level process with support coming directly from the President, the National Security Council, the Domestic Policy Council, OMB, the number 2 political appointee from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the number 2 person from the Department of Defense. And after 6 months of work, they have agreed to disagree. And we are at this point, not closer to our goal because they have a variety of arguments about the legitimacy of their unique qualities of their electronic records. So you know, sometimes it doesn't work out, and I'm not sure if we're going to recharge that effort next year or not. But again, the importance of high-level attention, the importance of a lot of focused discussions and a schedule of meetings, an agenda in the meeting, people having to report on what they've done, whether they're meeting milestones. Otherwise, any of these will certainly go off track, as some of ours have.
Thank you very much. I mean, we are also trying, but we call it team targets, and many of the elements that you said, it has to be the right people, right level, and those things, and some leadership from OMB type of organization. But my next question, I'm sorry, this will make it the last because people are getting hungry before someone faints here. We don't have an ambulance. There is, in 1993 you had, and you mentioned the Government Performance and Results Act, GPRA. And then under that, if you recall, you had performance agreements. President Clinton, as part of the reinventing the government, signed performance agreements with all, and we have an example which we share with people. Secretary of Energy Hazel O'Leary, she signed with President Clinton. What happened to that experiment? Of late, of course, in the websites we don't find. In those days, you could find all of them on the website, the performance agreements of all the government departments. What happened to those would be interesting. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I'm going to be really honest. Off the record, okay. Yes, the National Performance Review was a major effort under President Clinton. It was spearheaded by the Vice President then, Al Gore, who put an immense amount of effort into it. He had a staff that was created and situated within the Executive Office of the President. These were staff that were brought in from the federal agencies, as well as OMB, other policy councils. As you well point out, there were performance agreements reached with each department. What happened is that a new president came into town, and he wanted to do things differently. I think this is what happens in our system. Each president comes in with a slightly different approach to doing management. They all have really the same intentions, good government, but they want to put their particular stamp on it. And so some of the work that has been done in the previous administration sort of goes by the wayside. Now, I don't think it's all that negative, in part because we did learn a lot from that effort, and some of that information came into the effort that was then set up by President Bush. If you recall, I said that President Bush decided he wanted a really big management effort, and he wanted us to evaluate every single program of the federal government. Huge effort, and he wanted us to put all of the evaluations on on a scoreboard, and it was all public. We then had budget management reviews where we looked at what we were doing in terms of our budget request to see if it related to what was then called PART reviews, Program Assessment Rating Tool. You probably remember that. My point being is each president comes in with a different group of people, and they want to do things a little bit differently. Is this good for the system overall? Probably not the best way. On the other hand, having worked for several presidents, I will say there is some creativity that comes from this process. We learn from the past. But yes, the NPR has basically been replaced by other efforts. And I will say this, I think there is now underway a new management review and management agenda for the president's second term. So just as I was leaving, We had a large meeting of all of the agencies with OMB and the White House counsels to talk about what things should we focus on in the remaining days of this administration that we could really make a difference in, and that would not require legislation, because that would be too difficult in this particular environment. So that is another process that's underway that is slightly different.
It's a related question. The beauty of Government Performance and Results Act was that it was a law, and so that was a good thing. And I thought performance agreements were part of that law. So my question was, how could the law be changed? I mean, what happened? Was it not, or maybe our understanding is not correct? And I fully agree. Yeah.
And I didn't mean to imply we definitely are complying with GPRA. That we are doing, but the kinds of agreements that were part of the National Performance Review under Vice President Gore, President Clinton, have sort of morphed into what is now required under the law. Yes, the law is a law, and we are complying with the law. And I think the key aspect that I want to emphasize there is we're not focusing on just everything. We're focusing on top 3 to 5 priorities for each agency.
Actually, Bush, in a way, had improved things because he made it more, the management scorecard and everything was more. So in a sense, he may have responded to what he perceived was the gaps in those things and improved things rather than change. He was trying to improve. So that could be one way to look at it. Anyhow, thank you. This debate can go on and will go on informally over the lunch, and all it remains is for me to thank. On your way out from Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, this book will be available, so kindly pick up your copy. I think it's one of the most readable books on new public management and some of the things, concrete things that Mr. Miller has done at the state level. Particularly has worked with many state governments in fixing their government, so it answers Mr. Shyamal Ghosh's question. Thank you all for coming. This is first of the many series we will have under the Go Pempal, which is our community of practice. And I think an essential feature of this in future will be that you will have to go and register in this community of practice. We'll start sending notices so that people who are in that community can practice. You have to, in being part of the community comes with some responsibility, which is to check the community, what is happening, contribute to it. One of the things we find in the community of practice website is that people do not respond much. So then the communities die. I mean, communities are only as good as the people and what you contribute to it. It cannot be externally driven. Initially, it can start by some people putting it together, but it has to be an active, self-striving, self-thriving community. So with those, I hope you will follow the Go Pempal community and please register yourself so we can share all the PowerPoints, all the information, and continue to get your feedback on how we can improve things. And it is informal, it is not government, you're not dealing with Cabinet Secretariat in this community of practice. In fact, it is outside, so feel free to be part of it and say whatever you have to say. Ms. Peroff, thank you very much for coming from such a great distance, and thank you.
And I just want to thank you, Dr. Trivedi. This is a wonderful forum, and I hope it's the beginning of several more, especially the sharing of information across countries, and I think we'll all learn from each other.